Are you recording?
Yes.
Hi, this is the Underground Cartoonist. I don't know if that name is available for a YouTube channel. I am an underground cartoonist, so you may wind up with a channel that's called Sandez Rey, S-A-N-D-E-Z space R-E-Y, like Rey Mysterio, underground cartoonist. My name is J. Scott, 2 T's, Naylor, and my pen name is Sandez Rey. And this YouTube channel is going to be about all manner of unscripted things. It's going to be about comics, nerd issues, of course, because I am a comic book artiste, and we'll get into my qualifications as far as that goes in a moment. It's also going to be a lot of stories about things that have happened to me. I grew up poor in the suburbs, the hidden poor. I was child labor at the age of 12. I was a drug abuser at the age of 15, a teenage drug dealer in the 70s, teenage punk rocker in the 70s. So many fun times in the 70s and 80s. I stayed high for about 12 years straight. I'm not going to preach to you and say, don't use drugs. I don't care if you use drugs. I don't necessarily recommend it. I don't necessarily caution against it. It's also going to be a lot of stories about, comics, geek matters, punk rock, drugs, crime. There were some other big topics that I'm missing. Wrestling, professional wrestling, and just we'll discover as time goes on. So let's get into my credentials as who I am. I started out as a comic book artist, I would have to say about 23 or 24 years ago. I know when I married my wife in 1989, it was right after I had self-published my first comic, a comic called Jack of Nines, and disastrously lost about $1,500, but I did get national distribution from Capital City and Diamond, which were the two big comic distributors at that time. So we were married in 89, so I think my first comic was actually published in 88 or early 89. And after I was married, I worked very hard on my art. I didn't want to repeat the disaster of publishing a comic and having no one want to read it. My first comic was very poorly drawn, so I disciplined myself to drawing 30 hours a week in addition to working my job. I spent all my free time drawing basically, and I revolved my whole schedule around drawing. And I got better, and I started getting work around the time my son was born, about 19 years ago. Started getting work from independent publishers. So let's hold up some examples. This is a Paratroop issue from Comics Conspiracy, a small press publisher that I really enjoyed working with. I was actually the first artist they hired. This was the first comic they published, although this is not the first issue, this is issue 3. But I drew the first issue. It was supposed to be a 4-issue miniseries, and they were supposed to have a different artist on each issue, but the artist on issue 3 fell through, so I wound up doing issues 1 and 3. I didn't do the covers. They had separate covers for all the cover artists for all the issues already in place. Doug Mears, regretfully, passed away far too young. Great guy who ran this company. I really enjoyed working with him. One of my first independent comics that was published by someone other than me. Here's another example, Blue Midnight and the Moonlight Lady. If you like Ed Wood films and you think that Ed Wood is a great writer, you would probably like this comic. If you don't think that Ed Wood was a great writer, you probably won't think that this comic is great either. However, the art is pretty decent. I drew it, inked it, and it's about two blue-skinned vampires, brother and sister, who work in a circus and have some sort of feud going with Dracula. Blue Midnight and the Moonlight Lady, a true oddity from Twilight Odysseys. It should have been Twilight Oddities. But this is just two examples of the of the independent comic press that I worked for. I've always been into self-publishing. Having learned my lesson with Jack of Nines, I came back with a comic called Big Monster Fight, which was a comic that was way ahead of its time, but just happened to come out during the big sales bust of the 80s, when all the stores were cutting back on their circulation. The second issue actually did come out, and because it was the 80s, or was it the 80s? My timeline gets fuzzy. Let's just see the date here. Okay, I didn't put any date in the indicia. Wow, is that unprofessional? Anyways, I think it was the 80s. My first issue was actually numbered 0, and my second issue was actually numbered 1. And this issue actually has a dominatrix type character whipping the state of California. I don't know if you can see that. Okay, there's a dominatrix whipping the state of California. There's also a very busty blonde character, which is the grown-up Alice from Alice in Wonderland. That was the backup feature. The front story was Kaiju, and the backup story was Alice in Wonderland. Like I said, ahead of its time, this comic. It's a funny story. When I published this, the Diamond rep, who was the big distributor, Diamond was the big distributor of comics, the Diamond rep says to me over the phone, says, I don't know if you're, you know, California's a big state, there's a lot of comic book stores in California. I don't know if you're going to get a very good order, you know, when you've got the state of California getting beaten on the cover of your comic. And I'm like, are you kidding me? If I saw my home state of Minnesota on the cover of a comic taking a whipping from a dominatrix, I would have to buy that comic. I don't know what you are thinking about the minds of comic book fans, but that's a plus, not a negative. One thing I want to say about these comics is that this was during the Lady Death era of bad girls, so-called bad girls. They're actually good girls, who were very big. The busty characters were very big at that time in independent comics. So I tried to make fun of that, and what I discovered in trying to make fun of that was I totally thought I had exaggerated the bust lines in my first issue, and then when I saw it published, I thought, wow, those really aren't as big as what the other guys are doing. So I decided, instead of exaggerating the bust lines, although I did even more, I would exaggerate the bump where the nipple is. And I put these enormous bumps that were, you know, the size of golf balls on there. And it's been totally misunderstood, you know. I mean, it was a joke. It was parody of the trend at the time. But so many people have looked at that and not got it and said, wow, you have some sort of weird fixation on women's nipples, don't you? I'm like, no, it's a parody of the comic book trend of bad girls. But nobody got it, so what the heck. Web comics, you may have heard about web comics that are free. I was so far ahead of this trend. I had a paper free comic that was paid for with advertising. It didn't last long term. It could have. I had like 20 locations in supermarkets where this was on racks. You know, I had 10 Cubs, 10 Rainbows, which are big supermarkets around here. I had all sorts of bookstores that agreed to stock it on the free racks. I probably had 50 locations where this was being passed out in the Twin City, and I did a press run of 5,000 copies of 3 issues in the Twin Cities alone. So a total saturation for this area, and it would have been paid for with advertising, and it would have continued had I been professional enough to go around and sign people to contracts and get them to put down a deposit, because I had all the advertising for the first issue committed from people that I thought I could trust, who all gave me verbal commitments, like, yes, definitely, I am going to absolutely, definitely put the ad in, just tell me when you need the money, it's not a problem. I'm so excited about the project, and you know, these people pumped my ass full of sunshine. I thought they were actually going to deliver ads, and then when it came right down to it, I had like 12 ads sold, and 4 of them came in, and the other ones never showed up. I could no longer reach those people on the phone. They were ducking me. They were like, oh, I guess I can't actually put my money into something like that. Well, it was actually very cheap, you know. And Outpost 2000, great comic shop, bought the back page of every issue. I had ads. I was so good at selling ads, I actually had an ad from Bremer Bank, the banking chain, in this comic, because I did business with Bremer Bank, and I talked to the manager, and they placed an ad. You know, Uncle Sven's comic shop placed an ad. Rockets Blast, I think, toy collector, or Robert G. Johnson, Comet Toys, placed an ad. I had Video Update, placed an ad. But, you know, once I got behind the 8 ball and those ads that were promised did not show up, then I'm in the position of having to do all the artwork and all the writing and handle all the printing and the distribution and drop them all off myself, and at the same time try and sell ads, and that just didn't work. So if I had actually taken deposits and done a better job of being professional about forcing people to put up a deposit when they said they were going to place an ad, this would probably still be going on to this day. And because the whole concept of free comics was proven to be very successful by this. Because I'll tell you something, the guy that rented me the space in his free publication racks that were already in the supermarkets, he rented space I rented space from him for this publication. I asked the guy, and this was his professional business, you know, how many I should put in the rack. And these racks had like auto traders and, you know, real estate free papers, things like that. I asked him how many I should put in, and he said, well, you should put about 75 in each rack, and that should be good for, because I told him the next issue was coming out in about a month. And he said, well, that should be good for a month, easily. You're not going to give away more than 75 in a month. Well, what happened is, when I found out that they had actually distributed them, when I found out that yes, they're now in the racks, I went out to check the racks, and this was about 24 hours later after I had received a phone call saying that we have distributed them to the racks. The first rack I came to had nothing in it. I called the guy back. I was incensed. I said, you told me, you left a message that this has been distributed to the racks, and there's nothing there. And he says, well, we distributed them. We absolutely distributed them. And I'm like, well, that can't be. Let me check a few more racks. So I went and checked a few more racks. The next rack I came to had 3 left. The next rack I came to had 1. They had distributed them. 75 copies per rack. And those 75 copies had disappeared in 24 hours, leaving 1s and 2s left in the racks. So the whole concept of giving away comics for free and paying for it with advertising was completely validated. I just didn't have a staff of people to sell the advertising and to help me do the artwork, and it was too much, so I just let it lapse after 3 issues. But the Minneapolis Free Comic, it was a noble experiment. And it was way before webcomics, so I guess if I wanted to be grandiose about it, I could say, because this came out in the year 2000. What were webcomics in the year 2000? Not much. I guess I could say I invented free comics, but you know, I don't say things like that because that would be ridiculous. Nobody invented it. People have been giving away free things forever. Well, so then one night I was sitting there. How I became an underground artist and came to work for, you know, underground publishers is one night I was sitting down to dinner with my family, and I had young children at the time, and my wife had just come off work, and I was working weekends at a straight job and doing cartooning during the week, and I was getting about 35 hours in per weekend by working at these group homes where you can put in long hours. And I get the call around dinner time. I'm just about to sit down to my food. I get this phone call, and this guy says, "Hi, is this Jay Naylor?" I'm like, "Yes." I thought it was a salesman. I always hang up on salesmen, so I was about to hang up. And he goes, "Oh, this is Michael Dowers from Fantagraphics Books, and I'm just looking at this sample you sent in, and blah, 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 blah." And I was literally taking the phone away from my ear and hanging up when it sank into my brain that he had said that he was from Fantagraphics. And I'm like, wait, what? What? What are you from? What the hell is this? I'm sitting down to dinner here. And so dinner's cooling on the table. Michael Dowers was the editor of the Eros line, the E-R-O-S line, Eros line, which was the adult line of Fantagraphic books. And Fantagraphics, as you know, very respectable publisher, published Hate and Love and Rockets and a lot of very well-known strips. They also published a magazine in those days called the Comics Journal, which was the only like real serious, you know, about the art of comics magazine. So I thought, wow, Fantagraphics, that's like a big step up. Thing is, I didn't remember sending them any sample. Okay, I'm like, what sample are you looking at? Turns out I had sent them a sample as part of a mass mailing I did to comic book publishers looking for work, like literally 2 years earlier. And what had happened at Fantagraphics is that they had this Eros line, which was supposed to be adult comics, but they were non-pornographic. They were like R-rated, just boobs and butt adult comics. And they had been edited by either Gary Groth or Kim Thompson, one of the original founders of the company, but they had never really made much money off the Eros line. So they had hired this Michael Dowers to be the editor of the Eros line and to make it be more profitable, and they wanted him to turn it into hardcore, like adult sex comics, like hardcore underground comics. And so he had this brilliant idea of putting out sex anthology books, which would have very, ennobling titles like Blowjob, which was their most popular book, and Head, which was not the same. It was about the ladies' side of the equation. And then there was Rear Entry. There was no comic titled Normal Sex, but there was Rear Entry, and there was actually a couple issues of a comic called Pea Soup, which was about peeing, as if that has appeal to a broad market, right? And anyways, these were anthology titles. There was one called Dildo, named after sex acts or perversions or whatever. And he was, not surprisingly, having a hard time finding respectable artists that wanted to contribute stories to Blowjob. And so he was digging through the samples that had come in, and he had dug all the way back to my sample, which had to be caked with dust. He had to blow off the dust when he looked at it. It was a good 2 years old at least. But he was apparently impressed by something in that sample, or maybe he was just getting turned down by a lot of artists, I don't know. And he called me up and said, would I be willing? First, he impresses me with the fact that he's from Fantagraphics, and he says, well, we're doing these sex anthologies. Would you be willing to submit a story for a comic called Blowjob? Very tentative the way he asked. I think he had been turned down a lot. And I said, sure. Anything, right? Anything from Fantagraphics. And I immediately figured, I have respect for underground artists. I grew up in the 70s. I read Robert Crumb. I loved Spain Rodriguez. I loved the Freak Brothers, Gilbert Shelton. I loved Last Gasp, Echo Comics. I loved, all their comics. I was a big fan of Last Gasp. I had complete runs of Slow Death and Skull, and I just loved underground comics. So I had no moral problem with doing a story for them. And I was essentially, by the way, philosophically an atheist at the time. And we'll get into my whole religious history later, which is very convoluted. I've been like lukewarm Christian to red hot evangelical to total in-your-face annoying atheist to back. And I go to church now. I'm a Christian again, but I won't ever preach to you, so don't worry about it. But so yeah, we can do a video on my religious history some other time. But so I had no religious reason or other reason to turn down anything, and I figured, well, Fantagraphics, wow, it's got to be respectable, and if you do a good job, they've got to take notice of it. People are going to take notice of it. So I said yes immediately, and he said, well, I want you to do a 5-page story for Blowjob. And I said, great. Well, what do you want the story to be about? And he said, I want it to be about 5 pages. And it has to have a blowjob in it. And I'm like, oh, well, I see. I'm being given a free hand here. So that's great. That's the way I prefer it. I prefer a free hand. So I turned in the story, and that turned to a different story. And on the third story, he said to me, well, why don't you use that superhero character, that half-naked superhero character that you had in your sample? Because he thought that's what I was going to do from the beginning, but I didn't even remember what was in the sample. So I said, oh yeah, the Crimson Gash. Great title for a character who was originally conceived as an R-rated character and not as naked as she wound up being. But so I thought that over, and I thought, yeah, that's a good idea. And Crimson Gash, by the way, completely inspired by Keiko Kamen, the Go Nagai character from Japanese manga. And I'm a big fan of Go Nagai. And if you're a fan of manga and you haven't read Devilman, you have to read it. It's amazing, apocalyptic, super ultra-violent comic that you just have to read. And you should also read Cutie Honey, which is amazing. It's a great comic. And you should read at least the early parts of Mazinger Z, which is also a great comic. But so, yeah, I thought Keiko Kamen was this character who was all naked except she wore like boots and a mask. And she was at this high school where the female students were always being tortured and abused by the headmaster and his evil like teachers, and they'd be tied up in these bondage positions, and then Keiko Kamen would come and save the day with her naked kung fu. And actually her signature move was like a flying head scissors, where they would airbrush out or use a shine, an artistic flash of light in the genitals region to obscure the genitals, because they couldn't actually show the genitals in the comic, or even show pubic hair. And she would do a flying head scissors, and when she would come flying at these people through the air with her legs spread, the villain would always freeze because he'd be like hypnotized by her vajayjay, and it would always be like this complete hypnosis, and then she would execute this head scissors and make them submit. I thought, in adapting this for American taste, I thought, you know, people who, and my editor told me that bondage is a big seller, but I'm like, you know what, I don't want to do bondage. I don't want to show female characters tied up. I don't want to draw that. I don't want to show female characters being abused. Not because I'm any kind of like big feminist. It's just that I much prefer, you know, the sort of thing that Russ Meyer did. And Russ Meyer, the filmmaker, his women were always like Amazonian, and they always were surrounded by these Weasley little lick-spittle men who were never quite man enough to like master these huge, you know, Amazonian archetypes that Meyer created. And I thought, you know, what I want to do is I want to take the germ of the idea of Keiko Kamen and combine it with sort of a Russ Meyer mentality, where it's all about the busty Amazonian archetype that is constantly triumphing over and kicking the butts of these weak men. So I established a precedent with that, and I stuck to it. The Crimson Gash, I did 16 short stories. 2 of them were not Crimson Gash, so I did 14 5-page stories with the Crimson Gash and 2 full-length comics for Fantagraphics. And she was never hit. She was never kicked. She was never captured. She was never tied up. She was never abused in any way. She was always dishing it out, never on the receiving end. And I'm very proud of that, because that's what I set out to do. I felt that you didn't need variety in stories. I felt that you could do formula and make it interesting, and you didn't have to have her be on the receiving end of anything. The comedy and the action and the sex speaks for itself, and there was a lot of comedy in those stories. But I'm not going to pull them out and show them all to you. I will show you the 2 full-length specials, which my editor, by the way, there's a lot of specific sex acts in the anthology comics because it demanded it. If you had a story in blowjob, it had to have a blowjob. If you had a story in rear entry, there had to be some kind of rear entry. So I would take whatever stories that Michael Dower would give me. Like I said, I did 16 short stories, so when he told me the next one is for head, I would say, okay, that's all about, you know, going down on a female, so I have to work that into the story. I considered it a perfectly reasonable artistic challenge, since he basically gave me no other directions. He didn't ever tell me what to do with the story, so I had total freedom beyond putting the one sex act in. So to me, that wasn't much of a compromise, because I was getting paid for doing whatever the hell I wanted to do. So he kept promising that eventually I was going to get to do full-length books. He finally signed a contract with the guy after 16 short stories to do 3 full-length books. Okay, the first one was The Crimson Gash versus Hitler. I just want to point out that this is a comic that covers all of the issues in the Overstreet Guide. If you know what the Overstreet Guide is, you know that they will mark a comic as having a nuclear blast on the cover, or being a Hitler cover, or they have what they call headlights. Headlights means a prominent bust line on the cover. You know, or their bondage is another thing that they mark. They have all these things to signify these things that make comics a little bit extra collectible to people who collect those things. But when I did The Crimson Gash versus Hitler, I deliberately made it the first headlights, bondage, injury to the eye, nuclear bomb, nuclear blast, Hitler, drug and alcohol reference cover. It has all those things on this cover, and you probably can't see them, but you can look it up online. All those things are there, and here's me down the corner wearing my Sandez Rey mask. And the origin of the Sandez Rey mask is kind of a story unto itself, because I just simply wanted to insert myself into the stories as a narrator, but I didn't want to draw a lot of self-portraits. because I'm not good at it. I prefer to make up characters. So I drew myself in a lucha mask because I'm a lucha fan and I'm a wrestling fan. It's a lot easier to draw, and I also figured that would give me something that I could wear to the show. I ordered a mask from Nick Aboud in the Philippines, who custom made my mask. Did a great job, got it through highspots.com, very reasonable price. And it was an original mask, and I would wear it with like a suit jacket, or and have sort of a Santo at ease sort of look at the comic shows. And totally misunderstood. Most people didn't get it, but that's fine. I've never looked for understanding from people. So did the Crimson Gash versus Hitler, and then the second one from Fantagraphics was the Crimson Gash versus Crime. See if I can get that. Yeah, there it is. Crimson Gash versus Crime. And that was 2 out of 3 on the contract. And then when I was just setting out to do the third, actually when I was most of the way through the second, he told me that Michael Dowers called me up and told me that Fantagraphics was scaling back their commitment to underground comics, and that they were going to cancel the entire adult line of Eros line. They were going to cancel all the anthology books, and they were going to beg off essentially the third issue of the contract they signed, which I probably could have held them to that, threatened to get a lawyer or something, and maybe they would have paid off a little something for it, the advance, but it wasn't worth it to go after them. Frankly, working for Fantagraphics in that era, I don't know what they're like now. It was no cup of tea working for Fantagraphics in that era. They were borderline insolvent for most of the 4 years that I worked with them. When you turned in a request for royalties, you would what you had to do was royalties were figured on a quarterly basis, and you had to wait till the quarter was over, and it was the quarter your book was published in and distributed in, not the quarter you turned the job in. So you waited for the book to come out, then you waited for the quarter to end, and then you turned in your request for royalties through your editor, and then they took that request and they put it on the bottom of the pile of other requests. And when they paid down through the pile to get to your request, eventually they paid your royalties. They never tried to screw you out of your royalties, but it was like pulling teeth trying to get money out of them in any sort of timely fashion. And they would sign contracts saying that we will pay you the page advance, which was $20 a page, within 30 days of turning the job in, and that was a joke because they never did. And there was nothing you could do about it if you wanted to keep working for them. I'm sure they paid the page advance on time for the big famous cartoonists, but for us, underground adult people, they never paid it on time. And in fact, I got page advances that were so late that I burst out laughing when I opened them up the envelope and saw what book they were from. I remember getting a page advance on a book that had literally come out like a year and a half before. And it had taken them a year and a half to pay the advance that was supposed to be paid within 30 days. And by the way, while I worked there, at the time when I worked there, they had a website for adult comics that was so horribly mismanaged, it was like a train wreck. They literally had a website where nothing changed on the homepage for like 2 years straight. And they had a little section on the homepage that said new releases. And the same new releases were in that on the homepage for 2 years straight. And meanwhile, when they put out a new comic, they would just add it as a line of type further on the website. But if you went to the homepage, it would look like a dead homepage where nothing was happening. And it was so poorly managed. After I had done the 16 short stories for them, I went in there and searched my byline, my pen name of Sandez Rey, and I only found 2 books that listed my stories in out of the 16 that had been published. So, horribly mismanaged page. And like I've said many times before, if you can lose money selling porn, you've really messed things up, because you should be able to sell porn and make money. But with the Eros line, the fact is, you still had adult bookstores in those days. Those Eros comics, which were hardcore sex comics, were not in adult bookstores. They were selling them strictly through the mail and through whatever comic shops were willing to take adult comics, which is only a tiny minority of comic shops. Put yourself in the position of the comic shop owner. Even if you personally love Crumb and you love underground comics, you're going to take so much heat for the sale of adult sexual comics that it probably isn't going to be worth it for you, even if you want to sell them. You're probably going to, from a purely nut-cutting business decision, just looking at it, the cold hard facts of it, it's probably not going to be worth your trouble to sell adult comics. So they were in very few comic shops. The few comic shops they were in, they were put in bags, sometimes with boards partially obscuring the covers, so you couldn't even see the covers. The bags were sealed. You couldn't thumb through them. They were under the counter. They were behind the counter. They were places where you couldn't look at them, or you could mail order them. That's were your two choices. So of course they were losing money on their adult line, and eventually they canceled the whole line right out from underneath me, and that screwed me out of the third book I was going to do for them. But I had already planned a third book called The Crimson Gash versus Satan, which wound up going to a different adult publisher, Carnal Comics, which was published by Steve Crompton, who's the creator of Demi the Demoness. This is Crimson Gash meets Demi the Demoness. This is the alternative cover to The Crimson Gash meets Satan. Okay, it's the same comic. It's a 48-page comic. Because I was doing it with Steve Crompton, I had the freedom to go more into it, but he wanted to do a Demi backup story so you could sell it to the Demi fans, which is perfectly reasonable. So I gave him 32 pages on The Crimson Gash versus Satan, the most over-researched porno comic ever produced. I reread large parts of Dante's Inferno before I did this, and did a bunch of research about hell, most of which does not turn up in the comic. But this is the most over-researched adult comic ever. But so did the 32 pages for him. Then the two of us together did a 15-page backup story where the Crimson Gash meets Demi the Demoness. And that was a lot of fun. We put a lot of Lovecraft elements into it, because I'm a big Lovecraft fan from way back, although I read all of his stuff back in the 70s, so it's like kind of odd to describe myself as a Lovecraft fan, because I don't reread things. I'm always moving on to reading new things. So I like his work, but I haven't read any of it for 30-some years. So it's kind of a distant memory now. But we put a lot of Lovecraft into it. I penciled it, he inked it. He came up with the story outline. I wrote most of the dialogue. He added some dialogue. So it was a real collaboration. It was fun to work with. The trouble is, the whole market for underground comics in comic shops was just falling apart at the time when this came out. And even though it was a very good comic, I think it was the underground comic of the year. I absolutely do. I mean, I honestly think if there was a better... What year did this come out? I should take my glasses off, or else I'm constantly going to be looking over them like this. I honestly think this is a 2008. If there was a better underground comic than this that came out in 2008, I never saw it. To me, this was the underground comic of the year. Didn't make any big sales, didn't win any awards, but it was a great underground comic. But there was no market for it, so we didn't do another one. I should mention that one of my short stories from Fantagraphics was reprinted by Last Gasp, which was great because I was a huge fan of Last Gasp comics as a teenager. They put out a coffee table book called Best Erotic Comics of 2008. I think their intention was to put out one every year. No other books ever came out in the years after that, but they put out that one.